Thank you for joining us. We didn't want to end this series of big picture stories from the Old Testament without focusing a little bit on the story of the land of Canaan itself and the promise that God gives the people in the wilderness under Moses' tutelage and ultimately under Joshua as he leads the people across the River Jordan. This idea of a promised land. We sing about this all the time. If you are acquainted with very many hymns, I'm sure you can think of any number of examples. To Canaan's land, I'm on my way where the soul never dies. I'm bound for the promised land. On and on we could go. These stories that take their imagery from the story of Moses and the people out there in the wilderness. This is a very powerful image for us because we feel ourselves living in the wilderness. We feel ourselves wandering through time and space, waiting for God to fulfill his promises to us. We see it in prospect. He's delivered us out of Egyptian bondage, as it were. We've been taken out of our sins. We have been given this freedom in Jesus Christ. But we're not there yet. We haven't gotten to where we need to be, and there's still challenges in front of us. There are still obstacles in front of us. We may not make it. And it's our responsibility to see this through, to live for this period of time in the wilderness in a way that gives him honor and glory, that will build us up and encourage us and heighten our hopes for that day which will arrive for the faithful, the day that we are able to cross over to the other side. I went around and around trying to find a readable passage to discuss this. We could read the entire book of Deuteronomy if we wanted to, and clearly we don't want to do that. But I'll refer you to a passage in Numbers chapter 13 and 14, where the story of the spies going into the land and then coming back to give a report comes. If you remember the story, we'll do a little background here. Moses has sent spies out into the land at Kadesh Barnea. They've been in the wilderness for a couple of years now. He is ready to begin the invasion, and he sent a spy from every one of the tribes into the land, and they'd come back with a report. We'll pick up the reading in verse number 26 of chapter 13. The men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, "We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here's some of its fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev. The Hethites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan." And then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, "Let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it." But the men who had gone up with him responded, "We can't attack the people, because they are stronger than we are." So they gave the negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. "The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. To ourselves we seem like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them." Then the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children would become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole assembly of the Israelite community. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who scouted out the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite community, "The land we passed through and explored is an extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them." And we'll stop reading there in verse number 9. You know how the story goes, though. The people are not going to listen to Joshua and Caleb. They are going to continue to rebel. They are going to suffer a plague there on the spot. They're going to try to take the land anyway, even though God has told them they can't, that they're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And ultimately, an entire generation is going to die in the wilderness. And only Joshua and Caleb and the children are going to be able to enter into the land that God had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And only now was he prepared to fulfill his promise. This is an amazing image for us, an amazing encouragement as we ourselves wander in the wilderness. Their struggles are, in a very real sense, our struggles. And that's because our problem is the same as their problem. They are in the wilderness because of sin, and we are in the wilderness because of sin. This goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, of course, Adam and Eve, and they brought sin into the world, and because of that, the world was defiled, and because of that, our wanderings here, for however many years it happens to be, is fraught with difficulties and hardships and pain and injustice and all the rest of it. It all goes back to the Garden of Eden, which is, of course, derived from the Hebrew word for paradise. This is fellowship with God, the closest fellowship that we've ever experienced in the flesh. And we lost it. We lost it because of sin. And the world did not cease to exist, of course. God continued to allow us to exist as a species, as a race. He allowed us to exist. Most of us died in the flood, of course. We talked about that a while back. But we continue. And hopefully, at least, we learn and we prosper and we grow and we try to survive here in this sin-infested world, because the problems that brought us out of paradise in the first place are the same problems that are inflicting the world today. We are struggling while we're here on earth. We struggle with temptation, and we fall prey to temptation oftentimes. Even the best of us does. But that's the nature of the world out here in the wilderness. Even for those of us who have escaped Egypt, even for those who have found grace in the eyes of God, those who have had their sins washed away, we find ourselves drawn closer to him and we enjoy fellowship with him. But we have not gotten to Jordan yet. We have not gotten to paradise yet. We're still here in the wilderness. And the rub of it is this, that the same problems that brought the pain and suffering on in the first place, that made it necessary for us to be in the wilderness, are those same problems that make our dwelling here in the wilderness that much more of a challenge. If we are here because of sin, we suffer here because of more sin. And again, we're not just talking about alien sinners. We're talking about people who have a covenant relationship with God and still find opportunities to fall short. We still find weakness. We still fail in our efforts before God. All of us do, even Moses did. And certainly the best of us are going to continue to struggle. And we see that happening. We see it happening certainly in the people of the world. We see them diving headfirst into sin. We see problems with drugs and alcohol. We see violence. We see injustice and pain and all kinds of horrible, horrible things. And so many times we watch people suffer for their sins. We see it right in front of us. It's all played out right in front of us. And we just shake our heads in wonder and think, this person needs the Lord. This person needs Jesus. If they would just turn their life over to God, it would be so much better for them. And it would, in most areas at least. The problems of sin would not afflict us in the same way. And yet we ourselves oftentimes will fall victim to sin, and we ourselves will suffer because of that. We suffer in our minds because we feel guilty about this, and we suffer in our flesh because we're suffering the consequences of these sins. And all of this reminds us of who we are. It reminds us of how wicked our world is and how responsible we are for our own selves, our own lives, to live holy and righteous lives, to endure the wilderness, and to strengthen our faith here rather than allow it to be weakened. You can go either way, whichever way you want to go. You can choose to rebel against God in the wilderness. You don't have to. And certainly God doesn't want you to. But it is ultimately going to be our choice. If we can manage to reject sin, on the other hand, if we can manage to stay pure, or at least as pure as we can, if we will try to draw closer to God and build our faith up and build up our hope that one day we will cross over the Jordan, we will enter into this promised land. If we can keep that hope alive in us, we can one day reach that place, and we will find, I'm confident, that the difficulties, the hardships of this life will be rendered meaningless. Hopefully we can see that already. Hopefully our hope of heaven is so strong that we can already overlook the difficulties of this life. But we have confidence one way or the other that the toils of this life will seem nothing, as we sometimes sing in the old hymn, when we get to the end of the way. The hardships, the difficulties that Paul talks about of all of us, the entire creation in Romans chapter 8, struggling, groaning in the flesh, It will all be rendered meaningless. It won't matter anymore. So oftentimes, pregnancy is used as an image for our trials and difficulties in this life. We are going through travail, like we're in labor, and there's nothing worse. It's just the most horrible, horrible experience until it's over. And when it's over, none of it makes any difference because you've reached the end now, and you realize that all of it was worth it. Now, that's easy for the husband to say, of course, but the wives tell us the same thing, that it is absolutely worth it because the prize waiting for us at the end of the day is so glorious and so wonderful. That's what God is doing for us in the wilderness. He is preparing us. If we will be found faithful, if we can say no to sin, if we can embrace his lifestyle while we are here and move on to ultimately a sinless lifestyle in heavenly glory. Now, while we wait, though, point number 2, while we wait, there are going to be difficulties and hardships here in this life while we're in the wilderness, and God promises that he will supply our needs. And I emphasize the word needs because the Bible defines needs somewhat differently than I do or than you do or other people in our society do. We have a very flexible, a very fluid definition of needs. The needs that we have in 21st century America are different than the needs we had in the 20th century, different from the 19th century, and on and on and on we could go. It was not that long ago, historically speaking, where human beings didn't have any needs other than, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 6, verse 8, food and shelter. If I can manage to have enough food to eat today and have shelter from the elements, whether that's a roof over my head or a warm coat or a weapon to fend off the bear attacks, whatever it happens to be, if I have that, then I have enough to praise God. That's all that I really need for today. And we have gotten so far removed from that. I'm not sure how we could recreate that kind of environment, even if we wanted to. And I certainly don't want to. I trust you don't either. But there are people even today in this world who are living with much, much less than I have ever had in this life. The idea of a need is very, very basic. And we need to be reminded of that from time to time. God ministers to our needs, but the needs that we have in God's vision may not be the same as the needs that we have in our own vision. He will give us what we truly need. And that's where faith comes in. That's where believing that God is in control and that he knows best and he is giving us the things that we need and he's withholding from us the things that we do not need or that might even be hurtful to us. We don't always see his wisdom. We may complain about it from time to time. Certainly the Israelites complained in the wilderness because they were not given leeks and cantaloupe and all the various, what you might call luxuries that they had enjoyed in times past. That's the way the wilderness is sometimes. But God does not promise to give us contentment. He promises us that he will take care of us. Contentment is on us. We have to find the contentment. That's our job. He promises us daily bread. We have to find a way to be content with whatever form that bread takes, manna or whatever. That's our choice. And that's where we have to build our faith. We have to build our confidence in God and his ways. It's very easy to fall victim to temptation, wanting more, 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 especially when we're surrounded by people who have no faith in God at all and who absolutely abhor the idea of doing with one iota less than they can manage for themselves. A culture that's completely consumed with greed and selfishness and ambition and getting higher and higher. Things that don't necessarily imperil souls, but that may. And that certainly may imperil our souls while we're here in the wilderness. What we need to do while we are trying to get more, 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 if we are, and we in America certainly we'd like to have more. But while we are, we need to do what Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, finding the secret, he says, of having nothing or very little and having a great deal. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When we believe that his contentment can be found in God, our contentment can be found in God also. We can trust that Jesus is providing us with everything, and then it doesn't matter so much whether we have a lot or a little because we're not residents of earth anyway. We are looking to heavenly things. And however God chooses to bless us or not bless us in this life really isn't all that important. In fact, there may be a very real sense in which doing with less than we might like otherwise, or different than we might like otherwise, can be a way to build our faith, to build our hope, to remind us that God is in fact in charge and that we are not supposed to be completely and totally comfortable here. This is a reminder that Jordan still awaits. The promised land still awaits. We are still in the wilderness. Moses alludes to this concept in Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, giving a little bit more of the psychology behind the manna. He fed you with manna, he says, for these 40 years, in order that you might know that man does not live by bread alone, but on everything that proceeds from the mouth of God. It's not food that's sustaining you in the wilderness. It's not manna that's sustaining you in the wilderness. It's God. God is keeping you alive. And when we know that, we can say no to the temptation that confronts us, as it did Jesus at the hand of the devil in Matthew chapter 4. He is able to see that God is the sustainer of life. And we trust in him. And we believe that he is going to provide in his way. And we believe that his way is going to be enough. And that ultimately, of course, everything that God has promised to us is going to be found. Not here. But maybe that just makes heaven seem all that much sweeter as we wait for that time that it's going to arrive. And that brings up point number 3. The faith that God asks of us, the faith that we are building while we're here in the wilderness, this will be enough, or can be enough at least, to see us through these difficult times. And this is the problem, of course, with the vast majority of the Israelites, frankly, the vast majority of humans, while we're here in the wilderness, waiting for something greater. We don't have enough hope that God is actually going to deliver us. We would rather do the best we can with what we have on our own instead of trusting in him. Now, if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in Jesus, that makes sense. But we are believers. We are people of faith. And we trust that while we are here on earth, and maybe struggling somewhat in this earth, when God tells us of a land flowing with milk and honey, when God tells us it's just on the other side and that he will deliver it to us, no matter how unlikely it may seem, that should be enough to lift us up. And if there are obstacles between us and them, Anakim, the Nephilim, these giants in the land, walled cities, hardships, difficulties, pain and suffering, being outnumbered. If these seem like they are obstacles that are too big for us to conquer, we're right. They are too big for us to conquer, but they're not too big for God. And it's not that we are conquering the land on our own. God is giving us the land. He has already given us the land. It's only our job to claim it, to cross over the land and receive what God has given to us. Now, yes, that's going to require faith, and more faith than the overwhelming majority of people out there are going to have. But you can have this faith if you work at it. Lord, increase our faith, the disciples said. And we also need to be praying that as well. If we can just have that faith like a mustard seed that Jesus talked about, we can allow that seed to germinate in our heart and grow and blossom. And one day we can have faith that moves mountains. This can be us if we choose to do so. But we don't have to do that. You can go back to Egypt if you want to. And many Christians do. I've seen it happen. You've seen it happen too. People who lived their life in the wilderness and it got too challenging or got too puzzling. Too many obstacles, too much trouble. You know what? It's not worth it. I'm going back to Egypt. I'm going to go back into a life of sin. That may not be all that God had promised, but it's something. And I can appreciate the pleasures that are there. And so I'm going to take that instead of trusting that God is going to give me something better. That's a failure of faith. It happens over and over and over again. It happened in the first century. It happens in our lives. As long as Christians live, there will be Christians who fail this test, unfortunately. Don't let it be you. Grow your faith. Sustain your faith. Build your faith. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ, the text says in Romans 10, verse 17. Well, what better way to build your faith then than having more of the same? Read your Bible, then read it again. Read it constantly. Read it regularly. Read it deeply and thoroughly and studiously. And through it all, look forward to what God has for you rather than what is right on top of you. This is one of the most difficult challenges teaching children. Virtually anything. Driving comes immediately to mind, but pretty much anything works along the same lines. It's so easy to focus on the problems that are right in front of you. And we have to learn to look beyond that. The problem on your bumper is not going to kill you. The problem half a mile ahead is going to kill you. We anticipate problems. We deal with them. We see them coming ahead of time. And by doing that, we're able to avoid most of the short-term problems, the overwhelming majority of them. What a blessing it is for us to be able to live this kind of lifestyle, looking forward to what God has for us, rejecting the things that are in the past. Paul talks about this in Philippians chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, that he forgets the things that are behind and reaches forward to the things that are before, pressing on toward the goal for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. That's us. That's what we do. We don't focus on the wilderness. We focus on Jesus. And we focus on his promises to us. We focus on the home in heaven that waits for us after this life is over, and being found faithful here while we wait in the wilderness, however long it takes. Maybe it'll be 40 years, maybe it'll be more, maybe it'll be less. But however much of it there is or is not, we're going to spend every day of it thinking about heaven, thinking about glory, and preparing ourselves for that. And we have an advantage that others don't have, didn't have. Moses had to wait until the very end of his life to go to Mount Pisgah and look out over the River Jordan to see the land. The text says at the end of Deuteronomy. But it also says in Numbers chapter 21, verse 20, I believe it is, that peak of Pisgah also looks over the wilderness, the wasteland, some versions have here. Well, clearly, the most obvious explanation for that, of course, depends on which way you're looking. You can climb to the highest heights that God has given you and can use that as an opportunity to look at how miserable your life is, to look at how horrible your life has been and all the struggles and all the pain that God could have delivered you from and chose not to. And shame on God for that. You can do that if you want. You can look back at 40 years of misery and heartache and resent God with every fiber of your being. A lot of people do. But if you'll just turn around and look at the glory that is in front of you rather than the pain that you're in the middle of, you can realize how marvelous these promises are that God is giving us. That the glory waiting for us after the River Jordan is real, just as real as the wilderness is. You don't see it as well as you see the wilderness. You're not able to. But you see it in picture. You see it in promise. You see it in prospect. You see it by faith. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 tells us about, that this faith is the assurance of things that are hoped for. And what more is there to hope for than heaven? And so by faith we see the heavenly glory that's after this life. And we live our lives here in the wilderness in anticipation of that, knowing that one of these days, heaven is going to be our home. One of these days, heaven is going to be real, and we're going to be partakers of it. What a marvelous thing that is. I hope this encourages you on your daily walk so that you can draw closer to God and closer to heavenly glory with every step you take. Thank you very much. God bless.